The land along the Nile was narrow and green, a long ribbon of fertile earth pressed between two expanses of golden desert. For the people who lived there, this contrast was simply the shape of the world. The dark soil near the river, which they called the Black Land, was where crops grew and villages stood and children played near the water's edge. Beyond it, the pale desert, the Red Land, stretched quietly in every direction, vast and still and warm. The Nile itself moved gently from south to north, carrying water down from distant highlands and emptying eventually into the wide blue of the Mediterranean Sea. It was not a turbulent river for most of its length. It moved with a kind of patience, slow and steady, and the people who lived along its banks came to understand its rhythms the way you might understand the breathing of someone sleeping beside you. Predictable, dependable, a quiet constant in a world that otherwise changed slowly with the seasons. Each year, the river rose. It happened gradually, the water climbing up the banks in a soft flood that spread across the low-lying fields. This flooding was called the inundation, and it brought with it a layer of dark, rich silt from the mountains far to the south. When the waters receded, they left behind soil so fertile that almost anything planted in it would grow. This was the gift the Nile offered every year without fail, and Egyptian civilization grew up around that gift, shaped by it, dependent on it, grateful for it in ways that wove themselves into every part of daily life and religious thought. The farming year moved in 3 seasons, each one following naturally from the last. There was the time of flooding, when the fields were underwater and farmers rested or worked on other projects. Then came the time of planting, when the water had pulled back and the dark mud gleamed in the morning sun. Seeds went into the ground and the fields turned slowly green. Then came the harvest, warm and slow, when workers moved through the rows of wheat and barley with sickles, gathering what the river and the sun had helped to grow. It was a rhythm that repeated year after year for thousands of years, and the people who lived within it found a kind of steadiness in its repetition. Farmers lived in small villages near the water. Their homes were made of mud brick, a practical material formed from the Nile's own clay, dried in the sun until it was firm and cool. The walls of these homes were thick, which helped keep the interior cool during the long warm days and pleasantly temperate at night. Rooms were simple and comfortable. People slept on low beds or padded mats, covered with linen woven from the flax that grew along the river. Linen was the most common fabric in ancient Egypt, light and breathable and suited perfectly to the climate. A typical home might have a few rooms, perhaps a main living space, a smaller sleeping area, and a rooftop that served as extra living space in the evenings when the air cooled. Cooking was often done outdoors or on the rooftop, using small clay ovens or open fires. Bread was the foundation of the diet, baked in round flat loaves or shaped into other forms. Beer, brewed from fermented grain, was drunk regularly by people of all ages and was considered a wholesome and sustaining part of daily nourishment. Vegetables grew in small garden plots near homes, and fish from the Nile were dried and eaten throughout the year. Onions, garlic, lentils, cucumbers, and figs all appeared regularly on Egyptian tables. It was a simple diet, but one well suited to the land and the season. In the quiet rhythm of daily life, men and women shared many responsibilities. Women managed the household, but they also worked in fields during busy seasons, operated small businesses, wove cloth, and brewed beer for home use and for trade. They had legal rights that may seem surprising given how ancient this civilization was. A woman in ancient Egypt could own property, enter into contracts, and represent herself in legal matters. Widows managed their own estates. Craftswomen sold their goods in the marketplace. Life was not without difficulty, of course, but there was a kind of orderly fairness woven into the social fabric that gave ordinary people a stable place in the world. Children grew up near the river, and many learned their parents' trades from an early age. Boys from farming families learned to farm. Boys whose fathers were craftsmen learned the craft. Girls learned from their mothers the skills of the household and the market. Education in a more formal sense was available to some, particularly to those destined for roles in the government or the temples. Scribes were trained from childhood, learning first to form the complex signs of hieroglyphic writing and gradually advancing to the more efficient scripts used in everyday administration. To become a scribe was to enter a world of relative comfort and social standing, and parents who could arrange such training for their sons often did so. If you are still awake, simply let your mind settle gently on the image of the river and the fields, the mud brick houses warm in the morning sun, the sound of grain being ground softly by hand. The Nile was not only a source of food and water. It was also a highway. Boats moved up and down the river continuously, carrying grain, stone, timber, pottery, and people from one end of the country to the other. Sailing was simple in Egypt because the wind blew steadily from the north toward the south. A boat traveling south simply raised its sail and moved with the wind. A boat traveling north lowered its sail and drifted with the current. This natural arrangement made river travel remarkably easy and efficient, and it meant that even very heavy loads, including the enormous stone blocks used in monument construction, could be transported across long distances without extraordinary effort. Fishing was another quiet activity that took place on the river every day. Men in small papyrus reed boats cast nets or used long spears to catch fish, and the Nile offered an abundance of species throughout the year. Waterfowl nested in the reeds along the banks, and hunters used throwing sticks to bring them down. These scenes appear again and again in Egyptian art, painted on the walls of tombs and temples with a lightness and care that suggests the Egyptians found genuine pleasure in these activities. There is something serene about those images, the painted figures standing in boats among the tall reeds, surrounded by birds and fish and the soft color of the water. At the center of Egyptian society, at its very pinnacle, stood the pharaoh. The word itself means something like great house, referring originally to the royal palace before it came to refer to the person who lived within it. The pharaoh was not merely a king in the political sense. He, and occasionally she, was considered a divine intermediary, a being who stood between the human world and the world of the gods, maintaining the balance and order that the Egyptians called Mat. This concept of Mat was fundamental to how Egyptians understood the universe. It encompassed truth, balance, justice, and right order. It was the harmony of things, the way the world was meant to be, and it was the pharaoh's primary responsibility to uphold it. In practical terms, this meant the pharaoh oversaw the administration of the country, directed large construction projects, managed trade relations with neighboring lands, and presided over religious ceremonies at major temples. The pharaoh was seen as the chief priest of every temple in Egypt, though in practice this role was delegated to local priests who served as the pharaoh's representatives in religious matters. The pharaoh's image appeared on temple walls throughout the country, always depicted in the same calm, idealized way, offering gifts to the gods or receiving their blessing, a visual statement of the ongoing relationship between the divine and the earthly realms. Some pharaohs are better known to us than others. Hatshepsut, who ruled during a particularly prosperous period, is remembered for the great temple built for her at a place called Deir el-Bahari, a structure of quiet beauty carved into a golden cliff face. She organized trade expeditions to a distant land called Punt, from which ships returned carrying myrrh trees, resins, ebony, ivory, and live animals. Images of this expedition were carved on the walls of her temple, a detailed and peaceful record of the journey. Thutmose III expanded Egypt's reach into neighboring regions and is remembered as one of the most capable administrators the country produced. Amenhotep III ruled during a long period of peace and prosperity and left behind an extraordinary legacy of monuments and art. Rameses II, who reigned for an exceptionally long time, built temples and statues on a grand scale, leaving his image carved into the landscape of Egypt in ways that have persisted to the present day. Over time, the role of pharaoh passed from dynasty to dynasty, from family to family, across a span of time so long that it is difficult to hold in the mind all at once. Egyptian civilization endured for roughly 3,000 years as a recognizable and continuous culture. In that time, 30 dynasties of rulers came and went, each one inheriting the accumulated traditions of those who came before, adding to them, adjusting them, but never fully departing from the essential character of Egyptian civilization. This continuity is itself remarkable. Most civilizations rise, change dramatically, and eventually transform into something quite different. Egypt remained, through all its changes, deeply and consistently itself. The Great Pyramids that still stand on the edge of the desert near a place now called Giza were built during what is called the Old Kingdom, a period roughly 4,500 years ago. They were royal tombs, built to house the bodies of pharaohs and to serve as monuments to their reigns and their divine nature. The building of these structures was an enormous organizational achievement, involving not an army of slaves as was once assumed, but a large workforce of skilled and semi-skilled workers who were paid in food, clothing, and medical care, and who lived in organized villages near the construction sites. Archaeologists have found these workers' villages, and the evidence suggests that the people who built the pyramids were relatively well cared for, treated as valued participants in a sacred project. The work was divided carefully. Some workers cut and shaped stone in quarries. Others loaded the blocks onto sledges and pulled them across prepared surfaces to the building site. Skilled craftsmen fitted the stones together with remarkable precision. Overseers coordinated the work, and a hierarchy of administrators ensured that food, tools, and materials were delivered where they were needed. The process was slow and required years of sustained effort, but it was not chaotic. It was organized, methodical, and deeply purposeful. The pyramid shape itself had meaning. Some scholars suggest it represented the rays of the sun falling to earth, a kind of frozen beam of light in stone. Others note that it may have referred to the primordial mound of creation, the first land that rose from the waters at the beginning of time according to Egyptian belief. Whatever its precise symbolism, The pyramid was understood as a structure of transformation, a place where the pharaoh's earthly existence would end and his eternal existence would begin. Inside the pyramids, passageways led to burial chambers deep within the stone. The chambers were filled with goods the deceased pharaoh might need in the next life: food, furniture, clothing, jewelry, tools, and images of servants and daily activities that were believed to become real and useful in the afterlife. Over the centuries, the items buried with royalty and wealthy individuals became increasingly elaborate, a reflection of the Egyptians' deep and sincere belief that life continued after death in a form not entirely unlike life as they knew it. If you're still awake, simply continue listening. Let the image of stone corridors and quiet chambers rest softly in your thoughts, ancient and still. The Egyptian understanding of the afterlife was rich and detailed, developed over thousands of years and recorded in texts of considerable beauty. They believed that a person was made up of several distinct components. There was the physical body, which needed to be preserved to anchor the other elements to the world. There was the Ka, a kind of life force or double that remained connected to the tomb and needed to be nourished with offerings of food and drink. There was the Ba, often depicted as a human-headed bird, which could travel between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. And there was the Ark, the transformed and transfigured spirit of the deceased, united with the divine. The preservation of the body through mummification was central to this understanding. The process was careful and slow, taking many weeks to complete. The internal organs were removed and placed in decorated containers called canopic jars, each one protected by a particular deity. The body itself was dried with a natural salt called natron, then wrapped in layers of linen bandages, with amulets and protective objects placed between the layers. The whole process was accompanied by prayers and ritual, and when it was complete, the body was placed in a coffin, often nested inside a second and sometimes third coffin, each one decorated with images and inscriptions designed to protect and guide the deceased. The journey to the afterlife was not simple in Egyptian belief. The deceased had to navigate a series of challenges, guided by spells and instructions recorded in texts we now call the Book of the Dead. These texts were written on papyrus scrolls and placed with the body, or inscribed on the walls of tombs, ensuring that the deceased would know the correct words to speak at each stage of the journey. The most significant moment came in the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against a feather representing Mat. If the heart was as light as the feather, balanced by a life lived with honesty and fairness, the deceased was welcomed into the afterlife. If not, it was consumed by a creature and the person ceased to exist entirely. This was not a frightening idea in Egyptian thought so much as a logical one, a kind of cosmic accounting for the way one had lived. The afterlife itself, called the Field of Reeds, was imagined as a place very much like Egypt, with the river and the fields and the gentle rhythms of daily life, but without pain or difficulty or the uncertainties of mortal existence. It was, in essence, the best version of the life already lived, made permanent and peaceful. This is a rather comforting way to think about what comes after, a continuation rather than an ending, familiar rather than unknown. The gods who governed Egyptian life were many, and they were present in every aspect of existence. Ra was the sun god, perhaps the most central figure in the Egyptian divine world. He was understood to travel across the sky each day in a solar bark, a divine boat, bringing light and warmth to the world. Each evening he descended into the underworld and traveled through the darkness of the night, navigating challenges before rising again at dawn, renewed. This daily cycle was one of the most fundamental metaphors in Egyptian thought, a symbol of renewal, persistence, and the triumph of light over darkness, not in a dramatic way but in the gentle, inevitable way that morning follows night. Osiris was the god of the dead and of resurrection. His story, told in various forms across Egyptian history, involved his death at the hands of his brother Set and his subsequent resurrection through the efforts of his wife Isis. Osiris became the ruler of the underworld, a gentle and just king who presided over the fate of the dead. He was depicted wrapped in the white linen of a mummy, holding a crook and a flail, symbols of kingship and authority, his face green with the color of growing things, of renewal and life emerging from stillness. There was nothing frightening in his aspect as the Egyptians understood it. He was a benevolent presence, a guide to the world beyond this one. Isis was among the most beloved of all Egyptian deities. She was a goddess of magic, healing, and protection, and her story was one of patience and devotion. After the death of Osiris, she searched for him, gathered his scattered body, and used her great power to restore him enough to conceive their son Horus. She then protected the infant Horus in the marshes of the delta, keeping him safe until he was grown. Her image, with wings outspread in a gesture of protection, appears throughout Egyptian art, on coffins and tomb walls and temple ceilings, always watching over those in her care. She was called the Great Mother, and people of every social level prayed to her for help with the practical concerns of life, illness, protection in childbirth, safe journeys, and the comfort of those who grieved. Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis, was a god of the sky, depicted as a falcon or as a man with a falcon's head. His eyes were said to be the sun and the moon, watching over the world from above. The living pharaoh was identified with Horus, understood as the earthly manifestation of this divine figure. When a pharaoh died and was replaced by his successor, it was said that Horus had become Osiris, the transition from the living king to the eternal ruler of the dead, a seamless continuity between the two realms. Thoth was the god of wisdom, writing, and the moon, depicted as a man with the head of an ibis or sometimes as a baboon. He was the divine scribe, recording the words of the gods and keeping the balance of the cosmos in order. Anubis, depicted as a man with a jackal's head, was the protector of tombs and the guide of the dead through the underworld. His image appeared in many burial contexts, watchful and steady, ensuring safe passage. Bastet, a goddess with the head of a cat, was associated with warmth, protection, and the home. Cats were respected animals in Egyptian society, valued for their ability to protect grain stores from rodents and associated with the divine through their connection with this gentle goddess. Over time these gods became connected to one another in complex ways, their stories intertwined, their natures overlapping. Some gods were understood to be aspects or manifestations of others. Ra and Osiris could be combined into a single divine entity called Ra-Osiris, representing both the daily renewal of the sun and the deep continuity of the cycle of death and rebirth. This tendency to see unity within multiplicity, to find one fundamental divine reality expressed through many different forms and names, gives Egyptian theology a layered richness that scholars and readers have found endlessly interesting. Gradually, across the long centuries of Egyptian history, religious thought evolved and deepened. New gods were adopted from neighboring cultures and given Egyptian forms. Old gods shifted in importance as political centers changed and local traditions were absorbed into the national tradition. Through all of this, the essential character of Egyptian religious life remained stable, centered on the themes of order, renewal, continuity, and the care of the divine for the human. If you're still awake, let these gentle figures move slowly through your thoughts. A falcon crossing a pale sky. A woman with wings of linen white. A figure wrapped in bandages, holding a crook, standing quietly at the edge of the world. The system of writing that ancient Egyptians developed is one of their most recognizable legacies. Hieroglyphs, the formal writing system used for religious and monumental texts, were a combination of sounds and ideas expressed through pictures. A drawing of a water ripple could represent the sound of the letter N. An owl could represent the letter M. A seated man with his hand to his mouth could indicate speaking, thinking, or eating depending on context. The system was elaborate and required years of training to master, but it was also beautiful in a way that few writing systems in human history have been. The word hieroglyph comes from Greek words meaning sacred carvings, and this name reflects where the script was most prominently seen, carved into the walls and columns of temples and tombs, painted in careful lines of color on plastered surfaces, pressed into clay or stone. The formal hieroglyphic script was treated with deep respect and used primarily for religious and official purposes. For everyday administrative writing, scribes used a simplified, flowing version called hieratic, which could be written much more quickly on papyrus or on smooth pottery surfaces. Later still, an even more simplified script called demotic developed and became the standard for ordinary written communication. The papyrus plant, which grew abundantly in the marshy areas of the Nile Delta, provided the primary writing surface for Egyptian scribes. The thick stems were cut into strips, laid in overlapping layers, pressed together, and dried to create sheets of a smooth, flexible material that could be rolled into scrolls. These scrolls were surprisingly durable, and some have survived in the dry Egyptian climate for thousands of years. Through them we have access to Egyptian administrative records, medical texts, mathematical calculations, poetry, love songs, wisdom literature, and religious writings of extraordinary variety and depth. Egyptian literature is often overlooked in favor of the more visually striking monuments, but it deserves quiet attention. Love poems written on papyrus 3,000 years ago describe the feeling of seeing someone you love across a field, the quickening of the pulse, the way time seems to slow. Instructions for wise living, called wisdom texts, were composed with care and copied by scribes for generations, passing practical and philosophical guidance from one era to the next. Stories were told about clever heroes, magical transformations, and journeys to distant lands. These are fully human texts, recognizable and touching across the enormous distance of time. Mathematics and practical knowledge were also recorded with care. Scribes learned to calculate areas of fields for taxation purposes, to estimate the volume of grain in storage containers, to plan the proportions of buildings. Medical texts describe treatments for a wide range of ailments with a mixture of practical observation and ritual prescription, a combination that made sense within the Egyptian understanding of the world, where the physical and the spiritual were not entirely separate domains. Some of the medical observations recorded in these texts show a genuine empirical curiosity, a careful attention to symptoms and outcomes that would not seem entirely out of place in a later tradition of medical inquiry. Trade connected Egypt to the wider world in ways that enriched both material life and cultural exchange. Egypt had access to enormous quantities of grain and papyrus and gold, all highly valued commodities. In exchange, traders brought cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon, copper and turquoise from the Sinai Peninsula, lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, incense and resins from the lands to the south, and the exotic goods of Punt. Ships sailed along the Mediterranean coast and through the Red Sea, carrying Egyptian goods outward and returning with the products of other lands. The trade routes were ancient and well established. Egyptian merchants and diplomatic envoys traveled to the cities of the Levant, to Cyprus, to Crete, and to the civilizations of Mesopotamia further east. Objects made in Egypt have been found throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, and foreign objects found their way into Egyptian tombs and palaces. This exchange of goods was also an exchange of ideas, styles, and stories, and it meant that Egypt, for all its geographical isolation between desert and sea, was always connected to the broader currents of human civilization. The land of Nubia, to the south of Egypt along the Upper Nile, had a particularly close and complex relationship with its northern neighbor. At times Nubia was under Egyptian political influence or administration. At other times it was fully independent, and during one remarkable period it was actually Nubian kings who ruled Egypt, bringing their own cultural traditions to the ancient throne. This back-and-forth exchange across the boundary between the two cultures produced art and architecture that borrowed from both traditions and created something new. Over time, as the centuries passed, Egypt's connections with the Mediterranean world deepened. The Greeks came to trade and then to study, and Egyptian knowledge and traditions flowed into the Greek world in ways that shaped the development of philosophy, medicine, and art. When Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt in the 4th century before the Common Era, he was welcomed rather than resisted, and he made offerings at Egyptian temples and showed respect for local traditions. The city of Alexandria, which he founded on the Mediterranean coast, became in subsequent centuries one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world, a place where Egyptian, Greek, and other traditions mingled in the great library and the schools of philosophy and medicine. The Ptolemaic dynasty, the line of Greek-speaking rulers who governed Egypt after Alexander's death, adopted Egyptian religious practices and built some of the most beautifully preserved temples still standing. The temples at Edfu and Dendra, among others, were built or expanded during this period and retain much of their original decoration. Their walls are covered from floor to ceiling with inscriptions and images, a dense record of ritual, theology, and cosmic geography, all recorded in hieroglyphs that continued to be used for religious purposes long after simpler scripts had taken over everyday writing. When the Romans came and Egypt became a province of the Roman world, the old traditions did not immediately disappear. Emperors took on the title and the iconography of pharaohs when they commissioned work on Egyptian temples. Local priests continued their rituals. Ordinary people continued to worship familiar gods. The transition was gradual, and for a long time the ancient ways persisted quietly within the changed political order. If you are still awake, simply let your mind rest now in that long continuity, 3,000 years of civilization along the river, the same fields flooded and planted and harvested, the same prayers spoken in temples rebuilt and rebuilt again, the same stars moving overhead in their slow circle. The temples of ancient Egypt were not simply religious buildings in the modern sense. They were understood to be the literal dwelling places of the gods, the places where the divine presence resided on earth. The innermost sanctuary of each temple housed a statue of the deity, treated each day by priests who woke the god ceremonially, washed and dressed the statue, offered food and drink, performed prayers, and then closed the sanctuary again. This daily ritual was understood as the maintenance of the relationship between the human and the divine, a continuous act of care and respect that helped sustain the order of the world. The great temple complexes that developed over centuries were extraordinary achievements of architecture and planning. Pylons, the massive trapezoidal gateways that marked the entrance to a temple precinct, were covered with carved reliefs and painted in vivid colors. Beyond the pylon, an open courtyard might contain rows of sphinxes or colossal statues. A pillared hall, the forest of great columns that characterized Egyptian sacred architecture, led deeper into the building, the light growing dimmer as you moved inward, the ceiling lower, the space more intimate. At the very center, in the darkest and most sacred room, the god's statue rested in its golden shrine. The columns of these halls were carved and painted to represent the natural world, their shafts shaped like bundles of papyrus reeds, their capitals like open or closed lotus blossoms. The ceiling was painted blue and covered with stars, turning the indoor space into a representation of the night sky. Every surface told a story or conveyed a symbolic meaning. Walking through one of these spaces, even today when the paint has mostly faded and many of the statues are gone, produces a feeling of being inside something deeply intentional, a space built with complete care and absolute attention to the meaning of every detail. Some of the most moving of these spaces are the hypostyle halls, where dozens of enormous columns stand so closely together that the effect is one of being in a dense stone forest. The most famous is at Karnak, the great temple complex at ancient Thebes, where a hall of 134 columns still stands after 3,000 years. The columns are so large that several people standing with outstretched arms could not encircle one of them. The sheer scale produces a quieting effect, a sense of one's own smallness that is not uncomfortable but rather peaceful, a reminder of how much has existed before us and will continue after. Karnak itself was not built at any single moment but accumulated over centuries, with each pharaoh adding courtyards, pylons, obelisks, and smaller temples, until the complex covered an area larger than some ancient cities. Obelisks, the tall four-sided tapering pillars topped with a pyramidal point, were often erected in pairs at temple entrances. They were cut from single pieces of granite, an extremely hard stone, and transported along the Nile from the quarries at Aswan. Their surfaces were covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions recording the deeds and titles of the pharaoh who commissioned them. The very tips were sometimes capped with a gold and silver alloy called electrum that caught the first rays of the morning sun, a small daily moment of brightness at the point where stone met sky. The quarries themselves are interesting places, still preserved at Aswan in the form of partially cut blocks and ancient tool marks in the pink granite. One famous unfinished obelisk still lies in the quarry, abandoned when a crack appeared in the stone during cutting. It gives us a direct view of how these things were made, the slow chipping and grinding away of rock by teams of workers armed with stone tools and wooden wedges. The patience required for this work is almost impossible to imagine. Years of careful labor to produce a single column of stone that would then spend years more being transported and erected and inscribed. The statues that filled Egyptian temples and tombs were made with the same patient attention. Stone carvers worked with copper tools and abrasives, slowly revealing the human form from blocks of hard stone. The style of Egyptian sculpture is distinctive, calm and formal, the figures looking straight ahead, their weight evenly balanced, their expressions serene. This was not a failure of naturalism but a deliberate choice, a formal vocabulary that expressed the idea of the eternal rather than the momentary. A statue was not meant to capture a fleeting expression but to provide a permanent home for the ka of the person it represented. Painted relief carvings covered walls throughout Egypt, and their colors, where preserved, are still vivid and fresh-looking after thousands of years. The dry climate of Egypt has been remarkably kind to these surfaces. Artists used mineral-based pigments, ground and mixed with a binder, applied in flat areas of color with no shading or modeling. The effect is not realistic in the modern sense but intensely alive, the figures clearly individual and expressive despite the formal conventions of Egyptian representation. The way a figure holds their body, the gesture of a hand, the tilt of a head, all of these communicate character and feeling within the strict grammar of the style. The convention of showing the human body in a particular way, with the head in profile, the shoulders facing front, and the feet in profile again, was not because Egyptian artists could not draw a figure differently. It was a convention chosen to show the most recognizable view of each part of the body simultaneously, making the figure as complete and readable as possible. Within this convention there was room for great subtlety and expressiveness, and the best Egyptian artists used it with skill. If you are still awake, there is no need to do anything at all. Simply let the images continue to form and dissolve. The painted walls, the tall columns, the quiet river in the morning. The scribal profession occupied a respected place in Egyptian society. Scribes were employed in temples, in the Pharaohs' administration, in the management of large estates, and in the army. A scribe who did his work well could rise to positions of considerable authority and comfort. The officials who governed Egypt's provinces and administered its vast agricultural system were almost always scribes by training, men who understood not only writing and calculation but the whole complex system of Egyptian governance. The training of a scribe began in a place called the House of Life, a school attached to a temple or a palace where young boys learned to read and write by copying texts over and over until the forms became natural and effortless. They began with simple exercises, then gradually worked through increasingly complex texts. A trained scribe was expected to know the full range of hieroglyphic signs, the different writing scripts in use, and a broad familiarity with the canonical texts of Egyptian literature, religious writing, and practical knowledge. The education was long and demanding, but its graduates entered a world of real privilege. The papyrus on which they wrote was itself a significant commodity. Making papyrus required the careful processing of the plants in a pith, cut into strips and layered and pressed and dried. The resulting sheets were smooth, light, and durable. Rolls of papyrus were used not only for writing but also for wrapping objects and for making ropes and baskets. The plant grew in such abundance in the Nile Delta that it became one of Egypt's significant exports, used throughout the Mediterranean world as the primary writing surface until much later centuries when parchment made from animal skin gradually replaced it. Over time, in the quiet accumulation of the centuries, Egyptian culture developed a rich tradition of music and celebration alongside its more visible monuments. Instruments found in tombs include harps, lutes, flutes, clappers made of bone, sistrums that rattled gently when shaken, and drums of various sizes. Music was present at religious ceremonies and at feasts, played by professional musicians and by ordinary people in the course of their daily lives. The songs that were sung have largely not survived in a form we can reconstruct musically, but their words, written on papyrus, speak of joy and longing, of the beauty of the river and the pleasure of good company and fine food. Festivals were an important part of religious life. The great temples organized processions on particular days of the religious calendar, carrying the sacred statue of the deity in a golden bark on the shoulders of priests, moving through the streets of the town so that ordinary people who were not permitted inside the temple itself could approach and present petitions, receive oracles, and participate in the divine moment. These were occasions for music and offering, for the burning of incense and the display of beautiful garments. They gave the community a shared experience of the sacred that reinforced the sense of being part of something larger and more permanent than any individual life. The desert surrounding Egypt, though inhospitable to farming, was not simply a barrier or an empty space. It was a source of minerals and precious materials that were essential to Egyptian life. Expeditions were regularly sent into the Sinai Peninsula to mine turquoise and copper. Alabaster was quarried from cliffs in the eastern desert. Granite came from Aswan. Diorite, basalt, and other hard stones were hauled from remote desert locations to serve as material for statues and sarcophagi. Gold came from mines in Nubia and the eastern desert, and Egypt's abundance of gold made it one of the wealthiest states of the ancient world. In diplomatic letters exchanged with the kings of Mesopotamia, Egyptian pharaohs sometimes described gold as being as plentiful as dust in their land, a boast that suggests how central gold was to Egypt's sense of its own richness. Gold was used not only for jewelry and decoration but for the gilding of statues and sacred objects, for the creation of elaborate funerary equipment, and as a medium of diplomatic exchange. Gifts of gold went to foreign rulers as part of the ongoing maintenance of peaceful relationships. Gold was also paid to skilled craftsmen as part of their compensation. In a world without coined money, gold by weight served as a reliable store of value, and the gold of Egypt flowed through the ancient world along the same trade routes that carried grain and papyrus. The Valley of the Kings, situated in the desert hills across the Nile from ancient Thebes, was used as the royal burial ground for much of the New Kingdom period. Rather than building pyramids above ground, pharaohs of this era had their tombs cut deep into the soft limestone of the valley walls, the corridors and chambers hewn by candlelight over the long years of a reign, the walls painted and inscribed with the texts and images that would guide and protect the deceased. The valley is still and hot and deeply quiet, the kind of place where sound seems to be absorbed rather than reflected, and even visitors who know nothing of its history can feel something of its ancient purpose. The discovery of the almost intact tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 brought the world's attention to this valley and to Egyptian civilization more broadly. The objects found in that small tomb, the gilded furniture, the jewelry, the golden mask, the miniature shrines, the chariots and weapons and clothing, gave a direct and intimate view of the material world of an Egyptian pharaoh in a way that no amount of description could quite convey. Tutankhamun was a relatively minor king who ruled briefly during a complicated period of Egyptian history, and yet the objects made for his burial represent the work of some of the finest craftsmen of the ancient world, executed with a delicacy and care that still stops people in their tracks when they encounter them. If you are still awake, that is perfectly fine. Simply let the objects drift gently through your mind. The golden mask, the small alabaster lamp, the blue glass beads, each one made by careful hands, long ago. The animals of the Nile world were woven into Egyptian religious and cultural life in ways that reflect a deep attention to the natural world. The ibis, a long-billed wading bird that moved through the marshes with quiet dignity, was associated with Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. The falcon, soaring high and watching everything below, was the form of Horus. The cow represented Atha, a goddess of beauty, music, and maternal care. The scarab beetle, which rolls a ball of dung across the ground and lays its eggs within it, was seen as a symbol of renewal and the rising sun, the ball of dung becoming the sun rolling across the sky, life emerging from apparent decay. This ability to find meaning and symbol in the observed behavior of animals speaks to the Egyptian habit of seeing the world as layered with significance, the visible and the invisible always in dialogue. A crocodile sunning itself on a mud bank was also Sobek, god of the Nile and of power, resting in the world. A cat sitting quietly in a beam of sunlight was a domestic echo of the great goddess Bastet, the warmth of the sun made into fur and watchful eyes. This was not superstition in a simple sense but a sophisticated way of experiencing the world as full of meaning, every ordinary thing connected to something deeper. Sacred animals were kept at some temples, representing the living form of particular gods. A specially chosen bull could become an Apis bull, revered as a manifestation of the god Ptah, housed in a special enclosure, fed with great care, and buried with elaborate ceremony when it died. Cats were protected throughout Egyptian society, and harming one was considered a serious offense. Ibises and crocodiles were also kept at temples dedicated to their associated gods, cared for by priests and offered to as a way of honoring the divine. When sacred animals died, they were sometimes mummified and buried in dedicated cemeteries, which have been found by archaeologists in various locations, containing enormous numbers of carefully wrapped animal bodies. The Nile's flooding, which gave Egypt its agricultural abundance, was also associated with particular deities who governed the inundation. Hapi, a god depicted as a plump figure carrying offerings of lotus and papyrus, represented the flood itself, and prayers of thanks were offered to him each year when the waters rose. The flooding was never entirely predictable in its extent. A low flood meant that the fields would not be fully enriched and crops might be poor. A very high flood could damage villages and disrupt the farming calendar. A flood of just the right height was called a good Nile, and in years when this happened people gave thanks and celebrated the bounty the river had provided. Canal systems developed over time to manage the water more effectively, directing the flood into areas that might not naturally receive it and storing water in basins that could be released gradually as the dry season progressed. This water management required organization and maintenance on a large scale, and it was one of the practical responsibilities of local administrators. The same officials who collected taxes in grain and organized labor for construction projects also oversaw the digging and maintenance of irrigation canals. It was a system of integrated governance that connected agriculture, administration, and the natural world into a single functioning whole. The measurement of the Nile's flood was not left to chance. Special structures called nilometers were built at various points along the river, allowing officials to measure the height of the water during the inundation and predict what kind of harvest might follow. The readings were recorded and reported to the central administration, informing decisions about taxation, grain storage, and the distribution of resources. It was a practical example of the Egyptian tendency to observe, record, and organize, to bring the patterns of the natural world into the domain of human management. As the centuries passed and dynasties changed, Egyptian civilization experienced periods of centralization and periods of fragmentation. During the times called the intermediate periods, central authority weakened and regional powers asserted themselves, leading to a more varied and complex political landscape. These were not necessarily times of chaos or suffering for ordinary people. Local administrators continued to govern, temples continued to function, and the rhythms of agricultural life persisted. But the unity of the country was diminished, and the great building projects of the strong dynasties were not undertaken. Each time a strong dynasty reasserted central control, there was typically a renewal of building and artistic production, as if the civilization itself had been gathering energy during the quieter periods and was now ready to express itself again. The New Kingdom, which began around 3,500 years ago, was one of the most productive periods in Egyptian history, with extensive building at Karnak and Luxor and in the Valley of the Kings, and a flowering of the arts that produced some of the most refined and beautiful objects from any ancient culture. The New Kingdom also saw Egypt's most extensive engagement with the wider world, with military campaigns into the Levant and Nubia, diplomatic marriages with foreign princesses, and the influx of foreign workers, craftsmen, and ideas that came with all this movement. The city of Thebes, modern Luxor, was at the center of this world, a grand city whose temples were among the most imposing built anywhere in the ancient world. Its streets were lined with sphinxes, its harbors busy with boats carrying stone and goods and people. It was a place of considerable sophistication and cosmopolitan energy, even as it remained deeply and consciously Egyptian. Over time, as the New Kingdom ended and Egypt moved into its later phases, the country came under increasing pressure from outside. The Sea Peoples, groups of migrants and raiders from the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, put enormous strain on Egypt and the neighboring civilizations. The Late Bronze Age collapse, as modern scholars call this period, saw the end of many Mediterranean civilizations more or less simultaneously. Egypt survived, but in a reduced and changed form. The great power of the New Kingdom gave way to a more defensive and internally focused civilization. Still, Egypt continued. The temples were maintained. The gods were worshipped. The Nile flooded each year and the grain was planted and harvested. This is perhaps one of the most astonishing things about ancient Egypt, the sheer persistence of its civilization across difficulty and change. While other cultures rose and fell and were replaced, Egypt reinvented itself again and again, always recognizable, always essentially continuous with what had come before. If you are still listening, let that thought settle quietly. 3,000 years. The same river. The same stars. People sleeping in the same warm darkness, dreaming their own dreams. The art of ancient Egypt invites a particular kind of looking. Because so much of it was created for sacred purposes and follows strict conventions, it can initially seem repetitive or uniform to modern eyes. But the more closely you look, the more individual expression reveals itself within the conventions. A scribe's portrait in stone from the Old Kingdom has a particular alert intelligence in the eyes that makes it feel like a person rather than a type. A painting of geese from the same period shows each bird with such careful attention to the differences between species that modern ornithologists have been able to identify exactly which birds were being depicted. This combination of convention and careful observation is characteristic of Egyptian art and gives it a quality of quiet life that persists despite the centuries. The colors used by Egyptian painters have held up remarkably well. The blues and greens derived from copper minerals, the reds from iron oxides, the yellows from arsenic sulfide or ochre, the whites from calcite, the blacks from carbon, all remain vivid in protected environments like the interiors of tombs. Walking into a well-preserved tomb chamber and encountering those colors, still bright after 3,000 or 4,000 years, produces a strange sensation of time collapsing, the very great distance between then and now suddenly feeling permeable, as if the people who made these images are not quite as far away as they seemed. The jewelry of ancient Egypt is another area where the craftsmanship is extraordinary. Goldsmiths worked with thin sheets of hammered gold, shaping them into intricate forms, soldering tiny granules of gold onto surfaces to create texture, setting semi-precious stones in delicate bezels, creating pieces that are light and wearable despite their complexity. Carnelian, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and green feldspar were particularly favored, both for their beauty and for their symbolic associations. Blue was the color of the sky and the Nile, associated with divinity and protection. Green was the color of growing things, of renewal. Red was the color of the life force, of blood and vitality. Amulets, small objects believed to offer protection, were worn by the living and placed with the dead. They came in many forms: the scarab, the eye of Horus called the Wadjet eye, the ankh which represented life, the jet pillar which represented stability, the tight knot which was associated with Isis and protection. These objects were made in enormous quantities in faience, a glazed ceramic material that could be produced in vivid turquoise blues and greens, and in stone, metal, and glass. They were worn on necklaces, bracelets, and anklets, tucked into the wrappings of mummies, placed in the corners of rooms as household protection. The production of these objects was part of a broader craft economy that supported many workshops throughout Egypt. Potters, weavers, leather workers, carpenters, metalsmiths, glassworkers, and stonemasons all contributed to a material culture of considerable richness. Many of these craftspeople worked in state workshops attached to temples or palaces, producing goods for official and religious use. Others worked more independently, selling their products in the markets that operated in every town and city. Barter was the medium of most exchange in ordinary life. Grain was a standard unit of account, and prices of various goods were often expressed in terms of their grain equivalent. A mat might be worth a certain number of liters of grain. A pair of sandals might be worth another amount. An ox was a substantial unit of value, worth many measures of grain. These equivalences were widely understood and provided a functional system for daily economic life without the need for coins. Coined money came to Egypt only quite late, during the period of Persian and then Greek rule, and even then it was added onto existing systems rather than replacing them entirely. Over time, the village markets of Egypt were supplemented by larger commercial networks, both internal and external. Merchants traveled the river routes and the desert caravan paths, carrying goods between the various regions of Egypt and between Egypt and its neighbors. In the great ports of the Mediterranean coast, Egyptian goods met the products of Cyprus, the Levant, the Aegean, and eventually the wider Mediterranean world. This commercial activity brought not only goods but also ideas and people, contributing to the gradual transformation of Egyptian culture while never quite erasing what was distinctively Egyptian about it. The Greek writer Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century before the Common Era, wrote about it with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. He noted that the Egyptians did everything differently from other people, that women went to market and men stayed home to weave, that priests shaved their entire bodies where other people's priests grew long beards, that the country itself seemed to be a gift of the river in a way no other country was. His observations, even where they were not entirely accurate, capture something of the fascination that Egypt exercised on the ancient world, this ancient and self-confident civilization with its own complete and deeply considered way of doing things. As the Hellenistic period gave way to Roman rule, Egyptian religious traditions continued to spread outward into the wider world rather than simply fading. The cult of Isis in particular found adherents throughout the Roman Empire, her temples built as far away as the British Isles. Her image of the devoted mother, the powerful protector, the gentle healer, resonated across cultures in ways that made her one of the most widely worshipped deities in the ancient world at the height of Roman power. The Egyptian myth of Osiris, death and resurrection, order restored from disorder, also echoed through the religious landscape of late antiquity in ways that scholars have traced into many subsequent traditions. When Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire and then of Egypt itself, the old Egyptian religious traditions gradually faded from active practice. The temples closed or were converted. The hieroglyphic script fell out of use, and with it the ability to read the ancient texts was lost. For more than 1,000 years, the inscriptions on Egyptian monuments remained unreadable, a beautiful and present mystery. It was only in the 19th century, following the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, that scholars were able to work out the principles of hieroglyphic decipherment and begin the long process of reading what the ancient Egyptians had written. The Rosetta Stone itself was a piece of dark granite inscribed with the same text in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. The Greek could be read by scholars, which provided a starting point for comparing the 3 versions and working out correspondences. The decipherment was completed primarily by Jean-François Champollion, a French scholar who published his findings in 1822 and opened the entirety of Egyptian written culture to modern understanding. It was one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern era, and it transformed Egyptology from a field of speculation and wonder into one of systematic scholarship. Since then, archaeologists and scholars have worked continuously to understand ancient Egypt, excavating sites, analyzing objects, translating texts, and building an increasingly detailed picture of what life was like along the Nile across those 3,000 years. Each discovery adds something to the picture. A workers' village at the edge of a pyramid site tells us about the lives of ordinary people. A cache of medical papyri tells us about ancient healthcare. A collection of love poems tells us about the inner lives of people whose names we do not know, who lived and felt and expressed themselves in ways that are recognizably human across all the distance of time. If you are still awake, allow yourself to rest now in that thought. The same blue sky over the desert. The same river moving north. The same stars turning slowly overhead in the deep night. The legacy of ancient Egypt is present in the world in more ways than most people realize. The concept of a divine king who mediates between the human and the divine has echoed through many subsequent cultures. The idea of the afterlife as a continuation of the best aspects of earthly life has found expression in many religious traditions. The image of the pyramid has become one of the most universal symbols in human visual culture, used across centuries and continents to suggest permanence and aspiration. Egyptian mathematical and astronomical knowledge fed into the Greek tradition that eventually shaped the development of Western science. The calendar that Egypt developed, based on the solar year and divided into 12 months, is the ancestor of the calendar we use today. Egyptian observations of the stars, particularly the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which coincided with the beginning of the Nile's annual flood, represent an early and sophisticated form of astronomical attention. The ability to predict celestial events was connected in Egyptian thought to the ability to maintain the right order of things, and so astronomy had both practical and sacred significance. The form of the Egyptian temple, with its sequence of spaces moving from the public to the increasingly sacred and restricted, has influenced religious architecture in many subsequent traditions. The obelisk has been adopted by cultures far removed from Egypt in time and space, appearing in Rome, where many original Egyptian obelisks were transported by emperors who admired their form, and in later imitations in Washington, Paris, London, and elsewhere. The Sphinx, the seated human-headed lion, appears not only in Egypt but in the art of many neighboring cultures who encountered it and found it meaningful. Egyptian motifs entered the decorative vocabulary of Greece and Rome, and from there flowed into the art of Europe and eventually the whole modern world. The lotus, the papyrus, the scarab, the ankh, these forms appear in architecture, jewelry, and decorative arts across an extraordinary range of times and places. There is something in the clean simplicity of Egyptian forms that continues to speak across cultural boundaries, that continues to feel both ancient and alive. The study of ancient Egypt continues to produce new discoveries. Tombs are still being found in the Valley of the Kings and elsewhere. New settlements and industrial sites are revealed by remote sensing technologies. Previously untranslated papyri continue to yield their texts. The bones and mummies of ancient Egyptians are studied with modern techniques that can reveal diet, health, ancestry, and movement in ways that were impossible a generation ago. The picture of ancient Egypt that emerges from this ongoing work is richer and more human than the old image of pyramid builders and mummified kings, a civilization full of ordinary people living their lives with care and humor and love and hope. There is something comforting about ancient Egypt's endurance. In a world where things feel uncertain and impermanent, the image of a civilization that lasted 3,000 years, that built structures still standing, that recorded its thoughts in a script that can still be read, offers a quiet sense of perspective. Human beings have been making meaning out of the world for a very long time. They have been planting seeds and building homes and caring for their children and telling stories about the nature of the universe for as long as we have records, and probably for much longer. The Nile is still there. It still flows north to the sea. The desert still stretches on either side of it, pale and quiet and vast. The monuments built along its banks thousands of years ago still stand in the morning light, their shadows moving slowly across the sand as the sun rises and arcs across the sky and sets again over the western horizon. Night comes, and the same stars that the ancient Egyptians watched and named and measured begin to appear, one by one, in the deep blue that precedes full darkness. In the quiet hours of the night, with all of that time behind us and the river still moving and the stars still turning, it is easy to feel the weight and the gentleness of that long continuity. People have been falling asleep under those stars for thousands of years, their breath slowing, their thoughts softening, the day releasing its hold and the darkness offering its gift of rest. Whatever was carried through the day can be set down now. The monuments will still be there in the morning. The river will still be moving. There is nothing required of you in this moment except the simple act of letting go. Gradually, the images settle. The tall columns in the golden light. The painted walls with their vivid colors. The small villages along the river's edge, smoke rising in the early morning. The scribes bent over their work by lamplight. The boats moving slowly with the current. The sound of grinding grain and the smell of baking bread. The ibis standing in the shallows, perfectly still. The great stars of the Egyptian night, the same stars, still there above the desert, above the river, above everything that has come and gone and come again in the long slow turning of the years. Rest now. There is nothing more to know tonight. The river is moving in its ancient bed, just as it has always done. The night is quiet and the darkness is soft and there is nothing at all that needs to be held. Simply let the warmth carry you gently down into the deep stillness that has always been there, waiting patiently, the way the river waits and the desert waits and the stars above the pyramids quietly go on turning in their slow and ancient circles, through the long and peaceful night.